Have you ever felt that unexpected chill while driving alone at night? Have you ever been in a place that seemed normal, but soon everything felt strange, almost supernatural? In this video, you'll hear real stories from delivery drivers who encountered the unexplainable during their nighttime routes. Situations that start as just another delivery quickly turn into moments of pure terror. If you've ever experienced something you can't explain or love diving into mysteries that challenge reality, this video is for you. These people's experiences will captivate you from beginning to end, bringing that spine-chilling feeling and the curiosity only the unknown can provoke. Each story might make you rethink the simple act of opening the door for a delivery. So, if you enjoy scary stories and want to find out what these delivery drivers faced, stay until the end. You'll be surprised by what they encountered, or what encountered them. Marcos adjusted his headphones and checked the time on his car's dashboard. It was 11:45 p.m., his favorite time to work. At this hour, the city streets were almost deserted, with only a few people rushing by and the occasional car cutting through the silence. He always felt a certain calm at this time, when the daytime chaos finally gave way to peace. It was as if the world slowed down, allowing him to notice details that would go unnoticed during the day. Working as a nighttime delivery driver had its perks. Marcos enjoyed the solitude, the peace the city offered at night, and the streets that transformed into quiet corridors. There was no traffic, no honking, or pedestrians distractedly crossing avenues. To him, the night held a unique charm, something almost poetic. However, he knew many of his colleagues avoided working these hours. Some claimed that the night brought more dangers, but Marcos never paid much attention to that. To him, work was the same whether it was day or night. That night, the air was particularly cold, which helped keep his mind alert. His hot coffee, nestled in the cup holder beside him, was a constant companion. He was making yet another delivery in the city center, one of those office buildings that never seemed to close. He dropped off the order, exchanged a few quick words with the security guard, and was soon back in his car, ready to pick up the next order. As he drove through the empty streets, enjoying the quiet, he couldn't help but notice something different in the air. It was hard to explain. A sense that the streets seemed even emptier than usual, darker than normal. Maybe it was just the cold of the early morning, but Marcos felt a slight discomfort he couldn't quite identify. He ignored the feeling and decided to focus on the next order. His phone buzzed, and a delivery notification popped up on the app. The address was one he didn't immediately recognize. He found it odd, but he knew the city was constantly growing, with new neighborhoods popping up and others changing names. He checked the location. It was on the outskirts, a bit further from the center. He had made some deliveries out there before, but that specific address didn't seem familiar. Without hesitation, Marcos accepted the order. It was just another address, and he was used to working in more remote areas. The drive there would be smooth. Still, as he followed the GPS's route, that strange feeling continued to nag at him, like an invisible shadow hovering over the night. Maybe it was just exhaustion starting to creep in, he thought. It had been a long day, but he was almost done with his shift. The GPS signaled a route change, and he turned onto a narrower avenue, lined with tall trees on both sides of the street. The silence felt heavier in that area, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Marcos turned up the music to break the silence, but the discomfort remained, persistent. He glanced around and noticed that there were fewer and fewer lights in the houses and buildings as he drove further. The streets, once well lit by street lamps, were now illuminated only by the faint glow of his car's headlights. Marcos checked the address on the app again, just to be sure. He was on the right track. It was a typical order, he reminded himself. But there was something about the way the lights flickered in the distance, the absence of life in the streets, and the echo of his own thoughts that made him feel like he was entering uncharted territory, perhaps even unexplored. When he finally rounded the corner, he spotted the street of the delivery. It was an area he had never visited before. The houses were old, the gardens overgrown, and the feeling that something was off only intensified. He wondered how he had never passed through here before, but quickly shook the thought from his mind. It's just another delivery, he told himself, trying to focus on the job. After all, what could go wrong? Marcos glanced at the GPS again, confirming the address, which now seemed increasingly far from the route he was familiar with. The road was now leading him to an almost deserted area, where the city lights barely reached. The streets became narrower, the houses more spaced out, as if he were moving further away from everything he knew. With each turn, the sense of discomfort he had been trying to ignore grew harder to shake off. The order seemed simple, a food delivery, like so many others. However, the customer's name didn't seem familiar, and the address didn't ring any bells. He knew the city well, but that street brought no recollection. Perhaps it was a new street or one of those small roads rarely used. Still, something inside him warned that this delivery wouldn't be like the others. The music in his headphones no longer distracted him as it had before. His eyes focused on the GPS instructions, but every now and then, he glanced to the sides, noticing the eerie quiet surrounding him. The few houses he passed were dark, with no signs of life. No dogs barking, no lights on. Only the soft hum of his car's engine broke the silence. As he neared the destination, the GPS blinked, indicating a slight route adjustment. He followed the directions, but something felt wrong. The app showed an alternate path, taking him down an even more deserted street, flanked by tall trees and unsettling shadows. The GPS signal wavered for a few seconds, and Marcos almost considered stopping to recalibrate it. But the desire to finish this delivery quickly pushed him to keep going. The final street lay ahead, and he finally saw the name on a faded old sign. The place seemed forgotten by time. He parked the car next to a cracked sidewalk and took a good look at the house with the address. It was a large, old building, but extremely run down. The windows were shut, and the porch light flickered intermittently. The garden seemed abandoned for years, with overgrown plants covering what was left of the path to the door. He took a deep breath. It wasn't unusual to make deliveries to poorly maintained places, but this one seemed to be on another level of neglect. He checked the order on the app again. He was at the right place, but something continued to bother him. It felt like the house didn't belong in this time, as if it was out of place in time. He tried to ignore the strange feeling, focusing on delivering the order and getting out of there as fast as possible. As he opened the car door to grab the food, a cold breeze swept across the street, sending a shiver down his spine. The rustling of the trees around him was the only thing breaking the silence. He looked at the house again, trying to spot any sign of movement, any light, but nothing. The place was completely still. Marcos walked towards the house with the package in hand. As he approached the door, each step felt heavier, as if the atmosphere around him was changing. He thought about knocking, but something stopped him for a second. He couldn't explain it, but a feeling of alertness coursed through his body, as if the place was trying to tell him to leave. Still, he kept going. When he reached the door, he noticed that the paint was peeling, and the doorframe seemed warped from age. He raised his hand to knock but hesitated for a brief moment. Everything around him was too quiet. He knocked twice and waited. No response. Marcos looked back at the empty street and realized his car now seemed far away. The silence was oppressive, and the wind had completely stopped. Something was wrong, but he didn't know what. He waited a few more seconds, scanning the house for any sign of movement. Nothing. No lights turned on. No sound broke the heavy silence of the night. He knocked again, this time harder, but the result was the same. Absolute silence. A brief thought crossed his mind. Maybe the order was a prank, someone sending food to an empty house just to scare the delivery driver. He had heard stories like that from other drivers, but it had never happened to him. He turned, ready to head back to the car when something in his peripheral vision made him stop. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it looked like a shadow moving near one of the upstairs windows. His heart skipped a beat. He fixed his eyes on the window, trying to see if there was something there. The dirty, dusty glass made it hard to see, but he had a clear sense that something or someone was there, watching him. Maybe it's just my imagination, Marcos thought, trying to calm his growing nerves. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave him. The wind that had once blown strongly through the surrounding trees now seemed to have vanished, leaving the air heavy. as if even the environment around him was holding its breath. He decided to give it one more shot. Maybe the resident was asleep or simply hadn't heard the knocks. With a deep sigh, Marcos approached the door again. When he extended his hand to knock for the third time, the door, to his surprise, creaked open on its own with a loud, high-pitched groan. He instinctively stepped back, his heart racing. There was no one there. The darkness inside the house was almost absolute, broken only by the faint light from the street lamp filtering through the open door. Marcos stepped back, weighing his options. Logic told him to turn around and leave. Leave the food at the door and consider the delivery done. But something, perhaps curiosity or the need to understand what was happening, kept him there. Clutching the food package to his chest as if it would somehow protect him, Marcos took a hesitant step inside the house. The air in there felt different, thicker, damper, with a strong smell of mold and something metallic, as if time had stood still in that place. His eyes took a few seconds to adjust to the darkness, and what he saw only intensified his discomfort. The entry hall was covered in a thin layer of dust, as if no one had set foot there in decades. Old, decrepit furniture was scattered around the room, covered by white sheets stained with dirt. There were crooked pictures on the walls, the images almost unrecognizable due to the thick dust covering them. Everything in that place screamed abandonment. As his eyes wandered around the room, Marcos felt a slight breeze pass by him, cold and inexplicable. He looked around, trying to figure out where it came from, but the house was completely shut. The front door, which was still ajar, didn't seem to be the source of the wind. At the same time, the silence inside the house was disturbing, as if the entire place was waiting for something. He took a few more steps into the room, his shoes leaving clear footprints in the thick dust on the floor. When he reached the center of the room, a soft, subtle sound broke the silence. Footsteps. Footsteps coming from upstairs. Marcos froze. The sound was clear and distinct, as if someone was pacing back and forth on the upper floor, but with a strange, irregular rhythm. Whoever was up there didn't seem interested in coming down to greet him. For a moment he thought about shouting, calling out to someone, but his voice failed him. The house, with its dirty walls and dusty windows, felt more alive than any resident who might be there. He felt that, with each passing second, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Time seemed to slow down. His instincts screamed at him to get out of there as quickly as possible, but his feet wouldn't move. He remained frozen, the sound of the footsteps upstairs echoing through the house. It was as if the silence itself was conspiring to keep him there, as if he had trespassed into a place that shouldn't be disturbed. Marcos took a deep breath, trying to control the rising fear consuming him. The footsteps from upstairs had stopped, but now the silence felt even heavier. Each second inside the house felt like an eternity, as if time was dragging on, dense and oppressive. He still held the food package, but the object no longer seemed important. The only thing on his mind was the question: who was upstairs? The curiosity mixed with fear kept him rooted in place. He could run out of there, leave the package at the door, and never come back, but something made him hesitate. Perhaps it was the need to know, to understand what was happening in that house. Or perhaps it was the fact that leaving without an explanation would be just as unsettling as staying. With cautious steps, Marcos moved a few more feet into the house, his shoes kicking up clouds of dust with every step. The air felt heavy, and the smell of mold seemed to cling to everything around him. He stopped in the center of the room and looked around. To his right, a dark hallway extended to the back of the house, where he could barely make out the doors. To his left, an old wooden staircase led upstairs, where the footsteps had come from. Marcos hesitated for a moment, staring at the stairs. Each step looked like it would give way under the slightest touch, and the sound of the wind outside seemed to whisper warnings. He glanced again at the front door, still slightly open, an easy exit if he decided to leave everything behind. But before he could make a decision, something on the floor caught his attention. Near one of the sofas covered with sheets, there was an old photograph lying on the floor. He approached it slowly, and when he picked it up, he noticed that the image was partially faded with time. The photo showed a family, A man, a woman, and two small children, all smiling in front of the very house he was standing in. Marcos turned the photo over and noticed an inscription on the back. Summer of 1975. His breath caught for a moment. Something about that photo deeply disturbed him. He looked at the smiling faces, trying to ignore the feeling that they were watching him in return. The most unsettling part was the state of the house in the photo. In that old image, the house looked vibrant, full of life, completely different from the decaying, dark structure he now found himself in. It was at that moment he heard the footsteps again, but this time they were closer, as if whoever was upstairs was slowly ascending the stairs. Marcos looked at the staircase, expecting to see someone emerging at any moment, but the steps remained empty. The sound continued, however, each step heavy, dragging, echoing through the walls of the house. His heart raced and he took a step back. Panic began to set in, and the only thing he wanted was to get out of there. He dropped the photo back onto the floor and began walking towards the door, his feet moving faster with each step. But before he could reach it, the door slammed shut with a loud bang. The noise was so loud it echoed throughout the house, making him jump in fright. Marcos ran to the door and tried to open it, but it seemed locked somehow. He yanked the doorknob with all his strength, but it wouldn't budge. The air around him felt colder, and he began to feel sweat trickling down his forehead. Something was terribly wrong in that place, and now he was trapped inside the house. He looked around, searching for another way out. The windows were covered in a thick layer of grime and appeared locked. The sound of the footsteps had stopped again, but now he knew he wasn't alone. Something or someone was in that house with him, and the feeling of being watched was almost suffocating. Marcos knew he needed to find a way out. The food package he had brought was still in his hands, but it now felt like a bizarre reminder of the reality he had left behind outside. His eyes turned to the staircase one last time, and he heard a low, deep sound like a whisper coming from upstairs. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to run, but the door was still locked. He was trapped. Marcos could no longer think clearly. The sound of the now silenced footsteps continued to echo in his mind, and the image of that dark staircase haunted him every time he closed his eyes. He was trapped, with no easy way out, and something inside him told him that climbing those stairs would be a fatal mistake. Yet, his feet seemed to want to move, as if an invisible force was pushing him upward. The air inside the house seemed to grow heavier with every passing second. He struggled to breathe, cold sweat trickling down his neck as he tried to think of a solution. The windows were locked, and the door seemed held shut by a force he didn't understand. It didn't make sense. It was just an old, abandoned house, so why did he feel like he was caught in a trap? Before he could form a plan, something changed. The air around Marcos grew even colder, almost freezing, as if he was suddenly outside on a winter night. His eyes scanned the room for anything that could explain the sudden drop in temperature, but the room was empty. Then he heard it again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was a whisper, soft and distant, coming from somewhere upstairs. Marcos froze in place. The sound was almost imperceptible, like someone speaking in a tone too low to be clearly heard. He couldn't make out any words, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. Against his will, he took a step toward the staircase. His mind screamed for him to stop, to stay away from the darkness upstairs, but his legs didn't obey. Each step felt more automatic, more out of his control. Before he knew it, he was at the foot of the stairs, looking up at the top, where the shadows seemed to move on their own. The whisper continued, now a bit louder, but still indecipherable. Marcos began to climb, slowly, his heart pounding so hard he could hear the thumping in his ears. The steps creaked under his weight, and each sound echoed through the house, amplifying the oppressive silence around him. When he reached the top of the stairs, he stopped for a moment. The hallway in front of him was narrow and dimly lit, with closed doors on both sides. The house felt even older and more deteriorated upstairs. The smell of mold and something metallic, like rust or dried blood, filled the air. Marcos felt nauseous, but there was nowhere to go. He looked at the first door on his right. It was slightly ajar, and the whisper now seemed to come from inside that room. With slow, trembling steps, he approached, trying to prepare himself for whatever was inside. His hand touched the door, and he pushed it open slightly. What he saw made him step back, his heart racing even faster. Inside the room, the furniture was covered in white sheets just like in the living room, but it was the figure in the corner that terrified him. A dark shadow with no defined shape seemed to hover there, as if it was trapped between this world and some other. It had no face, no visible body, just a pulsating mass of darkness that seemed to grow and shrink like a beating heart. Marcos felt the air leave his lungs. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure in the darkness began to move, slowly and sinisterly, as if it was aware of his presence and drawn to him. The whisper grew louder, turning into a low, threatening murmur, as if it was saying something directly to him. Something he couldn't understand but that seemed to promise destruction. He turned to run, his instincts finally taking over, but the hallway now seemed much longer than before. His feet felt like lead, and he stumbled as he tried to descend the stairs. The sound of something dragging behind him filled his ears, and he knew that the thing in the room was coming after him. Desperation took over, and he forced his body to move faster. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he ran toward the front door again, but just like before, it was locked. He yanked the doorknob with all his strength, but nothing happened. The sound of something approaching him from the hallway grew louder, and Marcos felt panic engulf every fiber of his being. His eyes darted around the room, searching for another way out, and that's when he saw the window on the left side. Without thinking twice, he ran toward it. The glass was dirty and locked, but Marcos didn't care anymore. He grabbed one of the old metal ornaments from the shelf and smashed it against the glass with all his might. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the house, blending with the whisper that now seemed right behind him. Without hesitation, he jumped through the broken window, feeling the shards of glass cut into his skin as he fell outside. Marcos hit the ground with a dull thud, the impact of the fall reverberating through his body. He felt a sharp pain shoot through his leg as he landed, but there was no time to worry about that. His instincts screamed at him to keep running, to get as far away from that house as possible. The cold night wind hit his face, mixed with the heat of his sweat and the blood now trickling from the small cuts caused by the broken glass. He quickly got to his feet, limping as he moved away from the house. The sound of the whisper inside had stopped, but the feeling of being pursued hadn't. Every shadow around him seemed to move, as if something was watching him closely. He didn't dare look back. He knew that if he did, something terrible awaited him. His only thought now was to reach the car and get out of there as fast as possible. The street, which had earlier seemed strange and abandoned, now felt like a suffocating maze. The streetlights flickered intermittently, as if they were about to go out completely, plunging everything into absolute darkness. The sound of his own footsteps echoed in his ears, but something was off. There was another sound, a presence following him, something beyond his own heavy breathing and the cold wind. With his heart racing and his breath labored, he finally spotted his car parked across the street. It was his only chance to escape, to leave that cursed street behind. Every step he took toward the vehicle felt heavier than the last, as if the ground was trying to hold him back. Even so, he forced himself to keep going, ignoring the pain in his leg and the overwhelming sense of terror consuming him. When he finally reached the car, Marcos unlocked the doors with trembling hands and hurried inside. The silence inside the car was deafening. He shut the doors, and for a brief moment, the world outside seemed distant. His mind was still in shock, trying to process what had just happened. His eyes fell on the rearview mirror, and a wave of dread washed over him. In the reflection of the mirror, he saw something, a dark shadow with no defined shape, standing by the door of the house. There were no more whispers, but the presence of that figure was enough to freeze Marcos's blood. He swallowed hard, feeling his mouth dry and his heart pounding in his chest as if it wanted to escape. With trembling hands, he started the car, the engine roaring to life. Without looking back again, he sped off as fast as he could, the tires screeching on the deserted street. Every second, the car gained more speed, and the house grew smaller and smaller in the distance. But the feeling that the shadow was still following him remained. As he drove away, Marcos felt a mix of relief and terror. He was safe for now, but something inside him knew it wasn't over. Even after physically escaping the house, he felt there was still a connection to whatever had been there. His thoughts kept returning to the dark figure and the whisper that seemed to have rooted itself in his mind. Marcos drove aimlessly for a while, just wanting to get as far away as possible. The silence inside the car was oppressive, and every sound of the wind or the distant hum of the city made him jump in fright. He tried to process what had happened, but nothing made sense. How was that house still standing? And what was that thing that had chased him? Eventually, he found himself driving back toward the more populated part of the city. The streetlights and the few cars on the road made him feel a bit safer, as if the danger had been left behind. However, even with the familiarity of the streets and the return of human warmth, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with him, invisible but present. He stopped the car at a brightly lit gas station and, for a moment, allowed himself to breathe. The reflection of his face in the rearview mirror showed a pale, exhausted man, with wide eyes filled with fear. Marcos knew that what he had seen wasn't just an illusion or his mind playing tricks. He had seen something in that house, something not of this world, and somehow he felt it was still with him. Marcos stayed at the gas station for a few minutes, trying to calm his breathing and process what had just happened. The glow of the artificial lights and the calm movement around him helped him feel a little safer, but the sensation of being watched hadn't left him. The sound of the wind lightly tapping against the windows and the faint murmur of cars passing by seemed to bring reality back, but the image of that house remained fresh in his mind. He picked up his phone, still trembling, and opened the delivery app. He needed to report what had happened, to explain that something was wrong with that order, with that address. However, when he checked his delivery history, something made him stop. The order he had accepted, the one that had taken him to the house, was no longer there. Marcos scrolled through his recent deliveries, but there was no record of the order. It was as if it had never existed. A chill ran down his spine. How was that possible? He had accepted the order, driven there, entered that house, but somehow the app showed nothing. He tried to manually recalibrate the address, but the map only showed a blank spot, with no name, as if that street no longer existed. His mind spun in confusion, and exhaustion began to weigh on him. Nothing made sense. Trying to calm himself, he took a deep breath and decided to head home. Maybe, after a good night's sleep, things would make more sense. After all, he was exhausted, and whatever had happened could have been the result of his tiredness and the fear he had felt. That's all it is, he repeated to himself as he started the car and left the gas station. The streets were busier as he approached the city center, and the feeling of normalcy returned, bit by bit. The illuminated buildings, the people walking on the sidewalks, and the steady traffic made him feel like the night of terror was now behind him. Yet, deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. That shadow, that presence that had followed him from the house, still lingered in his mind like a recurring nightmare. When he arrived at his apartment, Marcos hurried inside, locking the door behind him. He looked around, making sure everything was in order. The silence inside was welcoming, almost comforting, but he couldn't deny the weight he still felt in his chest. He picked up his phone again, opening the delivery app once more. And once again, there was no sign of the order. It was as if the entire experience had become a void in the timeline. Too tired to think, he left his phone on the table and went to the shower. The hot water helped relieve the tension in his muscles, but his mind remained stuck in the house, in the footsteps, in the whisper. Even with his eyes closed, he could see the image of the shadow standing at the door, watching him. With each passing second, the feeling that there was more to this than just a mistaken delivery grew stronger. After getting dressed and lying in bed, Marcos stared at the dark ceiling, trying to relax. But as the minutes passed, he couldn't shake the impression that, somehow, that experience had marked him. Something had stayed with him, something invisible but present. He tried to push those thoughts away, convincing himself that everything would be resolved in time. But deep down, he knew the night wasn't over yet. Marcos lay in bed, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind spun in circles, always returning to that house, to the shadow that had pursued him, to the disturbing sound that still echoed in his head. His physical exhaustion was clear, but his mind refused to shut off. The darkness of the room was comforting, yet at the same time, it brought back the fear of being watched. He looked at the clock on the wall. It was 3:33 a.m. Time passed slowly, as if the world itself was slowing down. He closed his eyes, trying to relax when his phone vibrated on the bedside table. Marcos froze. At this hour, who could be trying to contact him? Reluctantly, he picked up the phone. A missed call notification flashed on the screen, from an unknown number. He frowned, feeling the cold return to his spine. He ignored the call and placed the phone back on the table, trying to push away the discomfort. But just a few seconds later, the phone vibrated again. Marcos looked at the screen. It was the same unknown number. His heart raced, and the fear began to grow in his chest again. He didn't want to answer, but something compelled him to act. With trembling fingers, he swiped the screen to answer the call. The silence on the line was absolute. "Hello?" His voice was weak, almost a whisper. No response, just an oppressive silence on the other end of the line. He was about to hang up when a very familiar sound filled his ears, the same whisper he had heard in that house. A low, indecipherable murmur, but clearly threatening. Marcos dropped the phone, which hit the floor with a dull thud. He jumped out of bed, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind screamed at him to leave the apartment, run, do anything, but he was paralyzed by fear. The whisper continued, now filling his head, as if it was coming from inside. Suddenly, he realized something, a detail he hadn't noticed before. In the mirror of the wardrobe which faced the bed, there was a shadow. The same dark, undefined form that had followed him from the house to the car. It was there, motionless but clearly present, watching him. He tried to blink, hoping his eyes were playing tricks on him, but the shadow remained. The truth hit him like a punch. He had never really escaped. Marcos stepped back, pressing himself against the wall, not knowing what to do. The shadow didn't move, but its presence filled the room with a suffocating darkness. The sound of the whisper intensified, and Marcos knew that the entity wasn't there just to watch him. It had followed him, and now there was nowhere left to run.